What was supposed to be a peaceful flight turned into a nightmare when both pilots suddenly lost consciousness. The private jet began to lose altitude as the crew descended into panic, with no one capable of taking control. But among the passengers, a 9-year-old boy possessed unexpected knowledge, and against all odds he offered to try and save the plane. With a storm approaching and time running out, he would have only one chance to land safely. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. Jack Thompson was only 9 years old, but his eyes shone with the intensity of someone who had already found their purpose in life. While other children his age entertained themselves with video games and conventional toys, he spent hours poring over aviation manuals and flight simulators. His room on the top floor of the family mansion in Beverly Hills, Los Angeles, looked more like a small aeronautical museum. On the walls, detailed posters of different aircraft. On the shelves, meticulously organized miniatures by era and manufacturer. And on his desk, a computer equipped with the most modern flight simulation programs. William Thompson, his father, was one of the most successful businessmen in the country. After building an empire in the technology sector, he had expanded his business into various segments, including a significant stake in one of the largest airlines in the United States. He was a pragmatic man who always encouraged his son to seek excellence in everything he did, even though he secretly wished Jack would follow in his footsteps in business. On that Friday morning, as the sun began to gild the skyscrapers of Los Angeles, Jack woke up even more excited than usual. His father had promised to take him to see the company's new private jet, a Gulfstream G650, that had just arrived at the private hangar at Van Nuys Airport. For the boy, it was as if Christmas had come early. "Dad, do you promise I'll be able to see the cockpit?" Jack asked during breakfast, barely able to contain himself in his chair. William smiled behind his coffee cup. "I promise, son. In fact, I have an even bigger surprise for you. Captain Anderson has agreed to give you a basic lesson on navigation instruments." Jack's eyes widened. Captain Anderson was a legend in American aviation, with over 30 years of experience. Having a private lesson with him was more than the boy could dream of. On the way to the airport, Jack couldn't stop talking about the technical specifications of the G650, impressing even Frank, the driver who had been working for the family for years. "Did you know it can fly at an altitude of 51,000 feet, Frank? And that it has the range to fly from Los Angeles to Dubai non-stop?" "I didn't know that, young Jack. You really know a lot about aviation," replied Frank, exchanging an amused look with William in the rearview mirror. When they arrived at the hangar, Jack was momentarily speechless, something rare for those who knew him. The G650 gleamed under the hangar lights, its elegant and aerodynamic lines emanating a beauty that only true aviation enthusiasts could fully appreciate. Captain Anderson, a tall man with graying hair and a gentle smile, was waiting by the plane's stairs. "So this is the famous Jack. Your father told me you're an aviation expert." "I still have a lot to learn, Captain," Jack replied, with a mixture of shyness and enthusiasm. "That's the right attitude, my boy. Even after 3 decades of flying, I still learn something new every day," said the captain, guiding Jack and William into the aircraft. For the next 2 hours, Jack absorbed every word from Captain Anderson like a sponge. He learned about navigation systems, safety procedures, and even had the chance to sit in the pilot's seat. His insightful questions and prior knowledge impressed not only the captain, but also the entire maintenance team that occasionally passed through the cabin. "William, your son has a natural gift," commented Captain Anderson as Jack explored the passenger cabin with Sarah, the flight attendant. "In all my years of career, I've never seen a child with such an understanding of aeronautics." William nodded, observing his son with a mixture of pride and concern. "Sometimes I wonder if I shouldn't discourage him a little. I have big plans for him in business." "With all due respect, sir," interrupted the captain, "some are born with such a clear vocation that trying to change it would be like trying to prevent the wind from blowing." The conversation was interrupted by Jack, who returned to the cockpit, practically bouncing. "Dad, Sarah told me you're going on a trip on Monday. Can I come along, please?" William hesitated for a moment. It was an important business trip to Washington, D.C., where he would present a new project to the federal government. He didn't usually take Jack on business trips, but something in his son's pleading look made him reconsider. The weekend dragged on for Jack as if each minute lasted an eternity. After much insistence, William had agreed to take him on the trip to Washington, D.C., on the condition that he maintain his exemplary grades at the international school he attended. Not that this was a problem. Jack was a brilliant student, especially in mathematics and physics, subjects he considered essential for better understanding the world of aviation. On Sunday night, as he organized his small travel bag, Jack received a special visit in his room. Emily, his mother, knocked softly on the door before entering. She was an elegant woman with intense green eyes that always seemed to hold an amusing secret. As a renowned neurologist, she spent much of her time at the hospital, but always found moments to connect deeply with her son. "So I hear we'll have a very special co-pilot tomorrow," Emily joked, sitting on the edge of Jack's bed. "Mom, No, I can't be a co-pilot yet," he replied, rolling his eyes but smiling. "But Captain Anderson said I'll be able to follow the entire flight preparation." Emily observed her son with a thoughtful look. "You know, Jack, your grandfather Robert was also passionate about aviation. He served in the Air Force before settling down." Jack's eyes lit up with the new information. "Really? Why did you never tell me this before?" "Maybe because it's a bittersweet story for me," Emily replied, adjusting a lock of her son's hair. "He had so many dreams related to aviation, but he ended up following a different path when he came here. Sometimes I wonder if he was really happy with that choice." The conversation was interrupted by William, who appeared at the door of the room. "Isn't it time for the little aviator to go to sleep? We need to leave early tomorrow." "Just 5 more minutes, Dad. Mom is telling me about Grandpa Robert." William exchanged a significant look with Emily. Her father was a subject rarely discussed in the family. "All right, 5 more minutes, but don't forget that the flight is scheduled for 9 a.m. and you said you wanted to follow the entire pre-flight checklist." After William left, Emily continued, "Did you know your grandfather had a notebook where he wrote down all the types of planes he saw passing by? He could identify them just by the sound of their engines." "Just like me," Jack exclaimed excitedly. "The other day I recognized an A330 just by the noise before I even saw it pass." Emily smiled, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "Jack, I want you to promise me something. No matter what happens, never let anyone diminish your dreams, even if they seem impossible or different from what people expect of you." Jack nodded solemnly, realizing that this conversation was more important than it seemed at first glance. "I promise, Mom." The next morning dawned with a soft mist covering Los Angeles, typical of autumn in the city. Jack woke up even before the alarm went off, already dressed in his favorite navy blue polo shirt, the same color as the airline pilots' uniforms. During breakfast, William received a call that left him visibly tense. Jack observed his father speaking in a low voice on the phone, making quick notes on his tablet. "Any problem, Dad?" he asked when William hung up. "Nothing you need to worry about," William replied, forcing a smile. "Just some last-minute adjustments to the presentation for the government." Emily, who was finishing her coffee, narrowed her eyes at her husband. After 20 years of marriage, she knew that tone of voice well. "William, are you sure everything's okay?" Of course," he replied quickly, checking his watch. "But we need to hurry. The weather is a bit unstable, and Captain Anderson wants to do a more detailed weather analysis before takeoff." On the way to the airport, Jack noticed that his father was quieter than usual, constantly checking messages on his cell phone. But his own excitement about the trip was too great to worry much about it. In his backpack, besides the tablet with his favorite games, he had put his special aviation notebook, a gift from Captain Anderson, and a small pair of binoculars he used to observe aircraft. When they arrived at the private hangar at News Airport, Jack immediately noticed that something was different from the last visit. In addition to the usual team, there were 2 men he didn't know talking in low voices with his father. They wore impeccable suits and carried executive briefcases, standing out from the more technical environment of the hangar. "Why don't you go follow the checklist with Captain Anderson?" William suggested to his son, clearly trying to distance him from the conversation. Take the opportunity to show him your notebook." Jack hesitated for a moment, torn between his curiosity about the mysterious conversation and the opportunity to follow the pre-flight inspection. Aviation won, as always, and he ran towards the aircraft where Captain Anderson was already performing the external inspection. "Good morning, young Jack," greeted the captain with his usual welcoming smile. "Ready to learn about the walk-around inspection?" "Yes, sir," Jack replied, already opening his notebook. "I read that we should start with the front of the aircraft, checking the radome and pressure sensors." Captain Anderson raised his eyebrows, impressed. "Exactly. I see you've been studying. Come with me, I'll show you each step in practice." As they walked around the aircraft, Jack absorbed every detail of the captain's explanation about the different components and systems. Sarah, the flight attendant, observed the scene from the plane's door with an affectionate smile, occasionally taking photos with her cell phone to show Emily later. "Captain," Jack asked as they examined the engines, "why are you doing a more detailed weather analysis today?" "Excellent question," Anderson replied. "We have a cold front approaching the East Coast. Nothing to worry about, but we need to evaluate the route well to ensure a smooth flight." At that moment, co-pilot Michael approached with some papers in hand. He was a younger man than Captain Anderson, probably in his early 30s, with an energetic and friendly manner. "I just received the latest weather bulletin," said Michael. "The cold front is moving faster than predicted. I suggest we adjust the route to avoid the area of greatest instability." Jack watched attentively as the two pilots discussed the alternatives, consulting maps and reports on their tablets. His attention was briefly diverted when he noticed his father still in a tense conversation with the men in suits, now accompanied by a woman who had just arrived. "Michael," called Captain Anderson, "please show Jack how we calculate fuel consumption. Considering the new route, I'm going to have a quick word with Mr. Thompson." As Michael explained the calculations, Jack couldn't help but notice how the co-pilot occasionally brought his hand to his forehead and blinked hard, as if he had a headache. "Is everything okay, Michael?" the boy asked. "Oh yes," Michael replied, with a forced smile. "Just a small migraine, nothing an analgesic won't fix." Sarah, who had approached to serve water, commented, "Michael, you should have said you weren't feeling well. I'm sure Captain Anderson would understand." "It's nothing serious," Michael interrupted her, seeming slightly irritated. "Besides, I've already taken some medicine. It'll pass soon." Jack frowned, remembering the lessons on human factors in aviation he had studied in his books. He knew that the health status of the crew was a crucial aspect for flight safety. He was about to ask more questions when his father and Captain Anderson returned. "Everything's ready for boarding," Anderson announced, but his usual tone of tranquility seemed slightly altered. William put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Jack, something unexpected came up. Maybe it's better if you go back home with Frank and—" "No, Dad, please," Jack protested immediately. "You promised. I've already studied the entire G650 manual. I know all the emergency procedures, and Mom already said it was okay." William exchanged a look with Captain Anderson, who gave a small nod. "All right," William conceded, "but I want you to promise to stay with Sarah at all times during the flight." In addition to the technical crew and the flight attendant, 2 executives from William's company, and the woman Jack had seen in the hangar, who introduced herself as Dr. Rachel, a legal consultant, also boarded. The boy noticed that everyone seemed tense, exchanging worried looks and talking in low voices. As he settled into his seat, Jack observed Michael making the final adjustments in the cockpit. The co-pilot still seemed uncomfortable, but tried to hide it. For a moment their eyes met in the reflection of the cockpit glass, and Jack had a strange feeling as if something important was about to happen. The takeoff proceeded normally, and the G650 soon reached its cruising altitude. Jack watched fascinated through the window as Los Angeles disappeared beneath a layer of clouds. In his notebook, he meticulously noted every detail of the flight: takeoff time, altitude, speed. Occasionally, Sarah would pass by him and smile, impressed by his dedication. William was immersed in an intense discussion with Dr. Rachel and the other executives. Jack could catch fragments of the conversation: merger proposal, Board of Directors extraordinary vote. Although he didn't fully understand the subject, he could tell it was something important by the tone of voices and tense expressions. "Jack, want to learn more about the navigation systems?" Captain Anderson called over the intercom, providing a welcome distraction. With his father's permission, Jack headed to the cockpit, his favorite place in the entire aircraft. "We're using the RNAV system for navigation," Anderson explained, showing the digital displays. "With the cold front approaching, we need to constantly monitor weather conditions." Jack noticed that Michael was paler than before, and his hands were shaking slightly as he adjusted some controls. Captain Anderson also seemed to have noticed something wrong with his co-pilot, occasionally casting concerned glances at him. "Michael, maybe you should rest for a bit," Anderson suggested in a low voice. "I can take over alone for a few minutes." "I'm fine, Captain," Michael insisted, but his voice sounded weak. I need... Before he could complete the sentence, Michael staggered in his seat. Anderson reacted quickly, taking over all controls. "Jack, call Sarah immediately." The boy ran to the passenger cabin, his heart racing. "Sarah, Michael is feeling sick." The flight attendant quickly headed to the cockpit, followed by William and Dr. Rachel. Jack watched from the door as Sarah checked Michael's vital signs, who was now completely unconscious. "He's breathing, but needs urgent medical attention," declared Sarah, who had first aid training. Captain Anderson maintained his calm, but Jack could see the concern in his eyes. "Air traffic control, this is November, Lima X-ray 500, declaring a medical emergency. Request authorization to..." His voice was interrupted by a sharp alarm sound. On the panel, several lights began to flash simultaneously. Anderson frowned, his fingers moving quickly over the controls. "This isn't possible," he muttered, checking multiple instruments. "The hydraulic systems are showing simultaneous failures." Jack, who knew the aircraft systems well through his studies, felt a chill down his spine. He knew that hydraulic systems were crucial for aircraft control. Even with redundant systems, multiple simultaneous failures were extremely rare. "Dad," Jack called, his voice trembling slightly. Captain Anderson isn't feeling well either. Indeed, the experienced pilot now showed the same symptoms as Michael: excessive sweating, tremors, and difficulty concentrating. His hands began to slip from the controls as he struggled to maintain consciousness. "William," Anderson managed to say, his voice getting weaker. "Something's wrong. There's something in the air." Sarah quickly grabbed the emergency oxygen masks, but it was too late. Captain Anderson lost consciousness, his body slumping over the controls. The aircraft began to gradually lose altitude, while the alarms sounded increasingly insistent. William tried to reach for the controls, but Jack stopped him. "Dad, no. If there's something in the cabin air, you'll pass out too. We need to think of something quickly." Panic began to set in among the passengers as they realized the situation. Dr. Rachel, who maintained surprising calm, asked, "Is there any other pilot on board?" A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Sarah, still holding the oxygen mask, looked at Jack. The boy felt the weight of all eyes on him. Years of study, simulations, and preparation had led him to this point. But was he really ready for this? I know the procedures," said Jack, his voice small but firm. "I know how each system of the G650 works. I've studied all the manuals, done hundreds of hours in simulators." William looked at his son, torn between fear and pride. The aircraft continued to lose altitude, and time for a decision was running out. Time seemed to have frozen inside the G650's cabin. Sarah quickly removed Captain Anderson and Michael from their seats, with the help of the other passengers, while Jack, trembling slightly, took position in the pilot's seat. His heart was beating so hard it felt like it wanted to jump out of his chest, but his mind remained extraordinarily clear. "Air traffic control, this is November Lima X-ray 500, said Jack on the radio, his childish voice contrasting with the seriousness of the situation. "Both pilots are unconscious. I need immediate assistance." There was a moment of silence on the radio. before a female voice responded, clearly surprised. November Lima X-ray 500, this is Washington Center. Confirm your situation. Who am I speaking with? My name is Jack Thompson. I'm 9 years old, and I'm the only one on board with aviation knowledge. The aircraft is losing altitude and the hydraulic systems are showing failures. Another moment of silence, followed by a new voice, this time male and with a tone of authority. Jack, this is Supervisor Tom Baker. We're going to help you. First, I need you to tell us your exact position and current altitude. Jack consulted the instruments, mentally thanking all the hours he had spent studying every detail of the panel. We're 120 nautical miles west of Washington, D.C., altitude 38,000 feet, descending at approximately 500 feet per minute. William watched his son with a mixture of terror and admiration. He had never imagined that his little boy, whom he still saw playing with paper airplanes last week, would one day literally have their lives in his hands. Jack, Tom Baker continued, I'm going to connect you with Commander Roberts. He's a G650 instructor and will guide you step by step. Sarah had improvised a small infirmary in the back of the aircraft, where she monitored the vital signs of the unconscious pilots. Dr. Rachel was assisting her while trying to contact medical specialists on the ground through her satellite. Phone? November Lima X-ray 500, Commander Roberts speaking. Jack, first thing, you need to stabilize the aircraft. Look at the artificial horizon on the central panel. Yes, sir, Jack replied, his voice firmer now. The nose is slightly low, 3 degrees negative. Very good. Gently, very gently, pull the yoke back. We want to level the aircraft. With extreme care, Jack adjusted the controls. His hands were too small to comfortably reach all the commands, but years of playing with simulators had prepared him to adapt his movements. Excellent, Jack, praised Roberts. Now about the hydraulic systems. What specific alarms are you seeing? Systems 1 and 2 with low pressure, sir. System 3 is still operational, but the indicators are unstable. William, who remained in the cockpit, felt completely powerless. All his power and money meant nothing at that moment. Everyone's life depended on the skills of his 9-year-old son. Dad, Jack called, surprisingly calm, I need you to be my eyes. Watch the right panel and let me know if any new alarms appear. At that moment, the aircraft entered an area of turbulence. The first clouds of the cold front that Captain Anderson had mentioned began to appear ahead. Jack felt the yoke vibrate in his hands as gusts of wind shook the G650. Commander Roberts, we're entering adverse weather conditions, Jack reported. Request permission for altitude change. Granted. Descend to 34,000 feet, you should find more stable air, but make a smooth descent, no more than 1,000 feet per minute. As Jack coordinated the descent, Sarah returned to the cockpit. The pilots are stable but still unconscious. Dr. Rachel got in touch with a toxicologist. They suspect some kind of contamination in the cabin air system. The pressurization system, exclaimed Jack, an idea forming in his mind. Dad, check. If there's any change in the air filters, there should be an indicator on the upper panel. William located the mentioned panel and noticed something strange. There's an alert here, something about the activated carbon filters. Jack, Robert's voice came back on the radio, we need to start planning the landing. There's an alternate airport 50 miles from your current position with a long runway and emergency services. The boy swallowed hard, stabilizing the aircraft. In flight was one thing. Performing an emergency landing with compromised hydraulic systems was a completely different challenge. But there was no choice. With the pilots unconscious and the rest of the system starting to show problems, they needed to get the aircraft on the ground as quickly as possible. Rain began to pound the G650's fuselage as the aircraft penetrated the clouds of the cold front. Jack kept his eyes fixed on the instruments, aware that he couldn't rely on external visual references in those conditions. The weight of responsibility seemed to increase with each minute, but he clung to the teachings he had absorbed over the years. November Lima X-ray 500, this is Commander Roberts again. The alternate airport is Dulles International. I'm going to pass the coordinates for approach. Understood, sir, Jack replied, his voice showing maturity beyond his years. But I have a concern. If there's something contaminating the cabin, Air, we need to ensure that the emergency team is prepared. On the radio, a murmur of approval was heard. Excellent observation, Jack. We've already activated specialized hazardous materials teams. Now let's configure the FMS for the approach. William watched his son with a new look. He had always known Jack was special, but seeing him maintain calm and think so clearly in a crisis situation was surprising. His thoughts were interrupted by Sarah, who returned to the cockpit with news. The pilot's blood pressure is stabilizing, she informed. Dr. Rachel got more information from the toxicologist. They suspect contamination in the air conditioning system, possibly related to a leak in the hydraulic system. Jack processed the information quickly. That would explain the simultaneous failures. Dad, please check the pressurization panel again. We need to ensure we're using clean air from the emergency tanks. As William followed his son's instructions, a new alarm sounded in the cockpit. Hydraulic System 3, the last one that was still functioning normally, was starting to show fluctuations. "Commander Roberts," Jack called, keeping his voice controlled despite the fear that was beginning to grow in his chest. "We're losing the last hydraulic system. This will affect the flaps and landing gear." "Understood. Jack, there's an emergency procedure for this situation. You'll need to activate the electric backup system for the landing gear. Do you know the procedure?" Jack closed his eyes for a moment, visualizing the manual he had read so many times. "Yes, sir. Section 3.4 of the emergency procedures, but..." He hesitated briefly. "I've never practiced this in the simulator." "Don't worry," Robert's voice conveyed confidence. "I'll guide you step by step when the time comes. For now, keep your focus on the approach." The turbulence increased as they approached Dulles. The rain was now torrential, drastically reducing visibility. Jack felt his back aching from the effort of reaching all the controls, but he didn't dare move much in the seat, fearing to lose the precarious adjustment he had achieved. Sarah returned with water bottles for everyone in the cockpit. "Jack, you need to hydrate," she insisted in a maternal tone. "It's been over an hour since you've been there." The boy took a few quick sips without taking his eyes off the instruments. His father took the moment to put his hand on his shoulder. "Son, I'm very proud of you." Jack wanted to respond, but at that moment, the radio crackled again. "November Lima X-ray 500, this is Dulles Tower. We have a runway prepared. For you and all emergency teams on standby. What's your fuel autonomy?" Quickly checking the instruments, Jack replied, "We have fuel for approximately 2 hours of flight, Tower. But with the compromised hydraulic systems, we need to attempt landing as soon as possible." "Affirmative," the tower responded. "We're diverting all air traffic from the region. You'll have absolute priority." The aircraft continued its controlled descent through the heavy clouds. Each small turbulence made everyone's heart on board jump. Jack maintained his concentration, mentally performing all the calculations necessary for landing. "Jack," Roberts called, "it's time to start the procedures for the landing gear. First, locate the emergency panel to your right." The boy stretched his neck, trying to reach the controls. His father, noticing the difficulty, quickly positioned himself to help. "Tell me what I need to do, son." "The panel has a red cover," Jack explained. "We need to open it and pull the emergency lever down, but only when Commander Roberts authorizes." The rain continued to batter the aircraft, which was now flying at only 10,000 feet altitude. Soon they would need to start the final approach. Jack knew he wouldn't have a second chance. With the compromised hydraulic systems, each movement would need to be perfectly calculated. As the G650 descended through the storm, Jack tried to remember every detail he had studied about emergency landings. The cabin was silent, except for the constant sound of rain and occasional alerts from the instruments. Sarah had ensured that all passengers were safely strapped into their seats, while she continued monitoring the unconscious pilots. "November Lima X-ray 500. You're 20 miles from the airport," Dulles Tower informed. "Wind 220 degrees. At 50 knots, gusts up to 25 knots. Visibility reduced to half a mile due to heavy rain." Jack quickly made the mental calculations. The conditions were far from ideal, especially for an emergency landing with compromised systems. His theoretical knowledge was vast, but now he would need to apply it in a real and extremely challenging situation. "Jack," Commander Roberts' voice returned to the radio. "We're going to start the landing gear procedures. Is your father ready with the emergency panel?" "Yes, sir," William replied, his hand positioned over the red lever. "Excellent. Jack, first I need you to reduce speed to 180 knots. This will give us more time for the manual procedure." With smooth movements, Jack adjusted the engine power. His legs barely reached the pedals, but years of practicing on simulators had taught him to compensate for his physical limitations with precise technique. "Speed stabilized at 180 knots, Commander," Jack reported. "Excellent. Now, Mr. Thompson, when I say pull the lever with constant force until you hear a metallic click." Dr. Rachel, who was observing everything from the cockpit entrance, couldn't contain her admiration. "It's amazing how he maintains his calm," she whispered to Sarah. Many adults would have panicked by now. "Now, Mr. Thompson," Roberts ordered. William pulled the lever forcefully. A hydraulic sound echoed through the fuselage, followed by a distinct metallic click. "Landing gear in motion," Jack confirmed. Watching the indicators. Green light for the nose gear, green light for left gear, waiting for confirmation on the right gear. The seconds dragged on as everyone waited for the last indicator. The sound of the rain seemed to increase, as if nature itself was testing their nerves. "Jack," Sarah called softly. "The pilots are showing signs of improvement. Their blood pressure is almost normal." It was good news, but Jack knew he couldn't count on them for landing. The responsibility remained entirely in his hands. Finally, the last green light came on. "Landing gear fully lowered and locked," Jack announced, allowing himself a small sigh of relief. "Very good," Roberts praised. "Now comes the most challenging part. Without the main hydraulic systems, the flaps will have limited capacity. We'll need to make a faster approach than normal." Jack nodded, even though he knew no one could see him. "Understood, sir. Approach speed will be 160 knots, considering the current weight and weather conditions." William looked at his son in amazement. How could he remember all these technical details at a moment of such pressure? "November Lima X-ray 500 Dulles Tower. Emergency teams positioned. Runway 1R cleared and ready for your landing." The aircraft crossed a particularly turbulent layer of clouds, shaking violently. Jack maintained control, his small hands firm on the yoke. 10 miles to the airport," Roberts informed. "Begin final. Descent. Maintain a 3-degree glide slope. Remember, without the flaps fully extended, your touchdown speed will need to be higher." Jack felt drops of sweat running down his forehead as he configured the final approach. Through the windshield, he could see only a gray wall of rain. He would have to rely entirely on the instruments. "Dad," Jack called, his voice betraying a slight tremor for the first time. "I need you to monitor the weather radar. Let me know if any storm cells appear in our path." William quickly assumed the assigned task, grateful to be able to help in some way. Sarah distributed water bottles to everyone, insisting that Jack take a few sips. 5 miles from the airport, announced the tower. Wind increasing to 20 knots, gusts of 30. Jack knew that the next few minutes would be the most critical of his young life. Without the main hydraulic systems, each movement of the yoke would need to be perfectly calibrated. Even a small error could be disastrous. The lights of Dulles runway began to appear through the curtain of rain, small bright dots piercing the darkness. Jack kept his eyes alternating between the instruments and the outside world, aware that the next moments would require all his concentration and skill. 3 miles to the threshold, announced the tower. You're perfectly aligned with the runway. Center line. Commander Roberts' voice returned to the radio, calm and precise. Jack, you'll need to maintain a higher speed than normal due to the limited flaps. This means you'll need more runway to stop. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Jack, replied his small voice firm. Current speed 165 knots, maintaining descent rate of 700 feet per minute. William watched his son with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The boy who still slept hugging his teddy bear was about to attempt something that few experienced pilots had ever faced. An emergency landing with critical systems compromised. 2 miles, the tower informed. Crosswind gust approaching. As if to confirm the warning, the aircraft was hit by a strong lateral gust. Jack reacted instinctively, compensating for the wind with precision that surprised even Commander Roberts. "Excellent correction," Roberts praised. "Maintain that level of attention. You're doing an incredible job." Sarah had ensured that all passengers were in the landing position with their seatbelts tightly fastened. In the back of the aircraft, the pilots were beginning to show signs of consciousness, but were still far from being able to take control. 1 mile to the threshold, the tower's voice sounded tense. Wind 240 degrees, 25 knots. Jack could clearly see the runway now, the approach lights forming a luminous path through the storm. Years of study and preparation converged to this moment. "Commander Roberts," Jack called, "with the hydraulic." "Systems compromised. The emergency brakes will be our only option to stop. Permission to use the thrust reversers at maximum power after touchdown." There was a moment of silence on the radio before the answer. "Permission granted. Your technical understanding is impressive, Jack." The aircraft crossed the runway threshold. At 50 feet height, Jack could feel every vibration, every movement of the wind, as if the aircraft were an extension of his own body. "Now, Jack," Roberts instructed, "start reducing the descent rate, smoothly." With extraordinary delicacy, Jack initiated the flare, the maneuver that would transform the descent into a gentle touch. His small hands moved the yoke with surgical precision, compensating for the wind gusts that tried to deviate the aircraft from its trajectory. 30 feet to 20 at 10. Robert's voice marked the final approach. The first touch was harder than planned, causing the aircraft to bounce slightly. Jack, however, didn't panic. He kept the nose slightly elevated, allowing the G650 to settle naturally on the runway. As soon as he felt the main landing gear firmly on the ground, Jack activated the thrust reversers at maximum power. The roar of the engines changed tone as the reverse thrust fought to decelerate the aircraft. "Emergency brakes in 3, 2, 1. Jack counted, pressing the pedals with all the strength his small legs allowed. The rain continued to batter the fuselage as the aircraft slid down the wet runway. Through the windshield, Jack could see the emergency trucks following his taxi, red and blue lights flashing in the darkness. "Speed 100 knots. 80, 60. William narrated the deceleration, his voice trembling with emotion. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the G650 came to a complete stop. For a moment, the only sound in the cabin was that of the rain hitting the metal and the whine of the engines decelerating. November Lima X-ray. 500, landing completed at 15:42 local time, announced the tower, unable to hide the emotion in the voice. "Welcome to Dulles, young commander." It was only then that Jack allowed the tears to roll down his face. His father enveloped him in a tight hug, also crying openly. Sarah applauded, while Dr. Rachel tried unsuccessfully to maintain professional composure. Within minutes, the G650 was surrounded by emergency vehicles. Specialized hazardous materials teams wearing protective suits were the first to enter the aircraft. The pilots, now semi-conscious, were quickly transferred to ambulances and taken to the nearest hospital. Jack was still in the commander's seat, his legs shaking too much to stand up. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and he finally felt the full weight of what he had just accomplished. Sarah gently placed a blanket over his shoulders, while his father remained by his side, a protective hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Thompson," called one of the hazardous materials team technicians, "we've found the source of the problem. There was contamination in the aircraft's air conditioning system." William frowned. "How is that possible? All maintenance is up to date with the best teams in the country." "That's why we need to conduct a detailed investigation," replied the technician. "This type of simultaneous system failure is extremely rare." Dr. Rachel, who had been on the phone for the last few minutes, approached with a grave expression. "William, we need to talk in private." Jack noticed the tension in the lawyer's voice, and even exhausted, his natural curiosity manifested. "Dad, does this have something to do with those people at the hangar in Los Angeles?" William and Rachel exchanged surprised looks. "How did you—" "I noticed something was wrong since the morning," Jack explained. "You were tense, talking in low voices, and Captain Anderson seemed worried after talking to you." A heavy sigh escaped from William. "Son, you're even more observant than I imagined." He paused, carefully choosing his words. "In recent months, I've noticed some irregularities in the company. Halted documents, inconsistent maintenance reports. That's why we were going to Washington," Rachel completed, "to present this evidence to the proper authorities. But it seems someone discovered our plans." Sarah, who was nearby organizing passengers' belongings, let out an exclamation of surprise. "So the air system contamination wasn't accidental," Rachel confirmed. "I've just received information that similar attempts were discovered on 2 other company aircraft." Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. His father, noticing his discomfort, quickly intervened. "But thanks to you, son, no one got hurt. Your courage and knowledge saved us all." "Mr. Thompson," called an investigator who had just entered the aircraft, "we need your statement, and young Jack's too, if he's up to it." "Just a moment," Sarah requested, returning with a hot chocolate for Jack. "He needs to recover a bit first." As he savored the hot drink, Jack observed the intense movement around the aircraft. Technical teams examined each system, collecting samples and photographing evidence. Journalists were already gathering at the limits of the security perimeter, their cameras capturing every movement. "Dad," Jack called after a few minutes, "what's going to happen now?" William sat down next to his son, putting his arm around his shoulders. "Now we're going to make sure all of this is clarified, and that the responsible people answer for their actions." "What about Captain Anderson and Michael?" "They'll be fine," Sarah assured, who had just received an update from the hospital. "The doctors have identified the substance and are administering the appropriate treatment. In a few days, they'll be recovered." A young paramedic approached timidly. "Excuse me. I know it's not the right moment, but my son is passionate about aviation, like you. Could you give him an autograph?" Jack blushed but smiled. "Sure, what's his name?" "Miguel. He's 10 years old and spends hours building model airplanes." As Jack wrote a kind message for Miguel, more people approached with similar requests. The story of the 9-year-old boy who landed an executive jet in the middle of a storm was already beginning to spread. 6 months had passed since that rainy afternoon at Dulles. William Thompson's office, on the top floor of his company's headquarters building, looked different. The old business photographs had given way to framed headlines: "Boy Prodigy Saves Aircraft in Emergency. Young Hero of American Aviation, the Little Commander." But the most significant change was in a new photograph on his desk. Jack smiling next to Captain Anderson, both in pilot uniforms, in front of a flight simulator. "I still can't believe you turned an entire room into a simulator for him," Emily commented, entering the office with a folder of documents. William smiled, adjusting his tie. "After everything that happened, it was the least I could do. Besides, Anderson said he's never seen anyone with such a natural talent for aviation." Captain. Anderson had fully recovered, as had Michael. The investigations revealed a deliberate attempt at sabotage by corrupt executives trying to prevent William from exposing their illegal activities. All those involved had been identified and were now facing justice. "By the way," Emily continued, "the school just called. Jack has been selected for the Air Force's Special Young Aviators program. He's the youngest in history to be accepted." William nodded, proud. After the incident, Jack's story had inspired significant changes in American aviation. A special program was created to identify and develop young talents, with an emphasis on safety and innovation. "Dad! Mom!" Jack's excited voice echoed through the office as he came running in, still wearing his school uniform. "Captain Anderson said I'll be able to accompany a real flight next weekend." Sarah, who now held the position of flight safety coordinator for the company, entered right behind him. "With all the necessary authorizations, of course," she added with a smile. "And Michael is going to be my official instructor when I start formal training," Jack continued, barely able to contain his excitement. Jack's transformation over the past few months had been remarkable. Although he was still the same boy passionate about aviation, he now carried with him a serene maturity. His experience had become an inspiration for other children, and he was often invited to give talks at schools about the importance of following one's dreams. "Oh, I almost forgot." Jack took an envelope out of his backpack. Grandpa Robert's letter arrived. Emily took the envelope lovingly. After the incident, she had managed to locate her father. The former Air Force pilot, upon learning of his grandson's story, broke decades of silence and now maintained regular correspondence with the family. "He says he's arranging everything to visit us next month," said Jack, who had obviously already opened and read the letter. "And he promised to show me his old flight logbook." William observed his son with a thoughtful smile. The crisis that had almost ended in tragedy ended up strengthening not only family ties, but also transforming the company. The changes implemented after the incident made it a reference in safety and transparency in the aeronautical sector. "Jack," Sarah called, "don't forget we have a meeting with the development team for the new youth training program in half an hour." "Of course, I just need to get my notebook from the simulator." As his son hurried out, William approached the window. Down below, the company's helipad was being prepared to receive a new aircraft, a modern training helicopter that would be used in the Young Aviators program. "You know," said Emily, hugging her husband, "when you told me your plans to expand into the aeronautical sector years ago, I never imagined our son would be responsible for revolutionizing everything." "He was born for this," William replied. "We just needed to learn to trust his instinct." Jack returned with his inseparable notebook, now accompanied by Captain Anderson. The experienced pilot had become not only the boy's mentor, but a kind of second father. "Ready for another lesson?" Anderson asked with a smile. "Always," Jack replied, his eyes shining with the same passion as ever. As he watched his son head to the meeting room, William reflected on how a moment of crisis had transformed into a new beginning. The little boy who dreamed of airplanes had become not only a hero, but a symbol that, with passion, dedication and courage, no dream is too big, even for the smallest hands.